Hi, I'm Steven. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
Good morning. I want to spend just a few minutes with you sharing some information. Do you have my charts? Do you know? Let me see. If you don't have them, that's not a problem because I have a copy here and I'll just speak to that. Sharing some information about the IBM Global Technology Outlook. Last year in 2007, IBM spent some time in a number of cities around the world brainstorming about Africa. And so I want to give you some background information about the IBM Global Innovation Outlook. There is a changing nature of innovation on the global scale. There's a paradigm shift that's happening, both when it comes to the nature and the scope of innovation. And that change is open, it's global, it's collaborative, and it's also multidisciplinary. When you think about innovation and looking at new inventions and new ways of doing things, there are many, many different disciplines that contribute to that process. It includes venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, academicians, global corporations, startup companies, community leaders, policymakers, regulatory bodies, investors, and business analysts, to name a few contributors to this innovation ecosystem. And so IBM started about 4 years ago. This year is the 4th year of focusing on a global innovation outlook, launched in 2004, and invited the external community to forecast business processes for the first time. And the objective is to have insights from these forums to share openly the opportunities that can be pursued on a collaborative basis. So the GIO, or Global Innovation Outlook Forum, that I want to focus on was the 2000 Forum on Africa. And in that particular forum, there were 9 deep dives that occurred in 7 cities around the world: Beijing, China, London, England, Paris, Lisbon, Dakar, Senegal, Cape Town, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, and Atlanta, Georgia. And out of those deep dives came a number of insights, some of which I'll share with you, and also some initiatives that IBM has sponsored along with some partners. So why Africa? Why focus on Africa for the Global Innovation Outlook? Well, Africa has positive momentum across the entire continent. It also has unprecedented global focus on social economic transformation. Many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have relatively stable governments, and in many instances, their fiscal growth rates are higher than those of the global growth rates. Africa also has significant direct foreign investment, and that, coupled with massive local entrepreneurship, is an enabler, if you will, for generating new possibilities for local and global businesses. And also technology leapfrogging and adoption rates create very new types of paradigms, very new types of opportunities for innovation that the world can benefit from. And I'd like to spend some time talking about the technology adoption rate, for example. Most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the landline capability for telecommunications is limited. But the mobile cell phone growth rates there are phenomenal. And it is truly changing the lives of all sub-Saharan Africans, improving their standard of living. They're coming up with some very innovative ways of using mobile technology. And I share with you today that it is my belief that in the future, it is not going to be the computer that's going to be the primary focus, but mobile technology. And the access that mobile phones give to telecommunications and therefore businesses. And I'll speak to that more a little later in this presentation. Some of the big questions that we asked as part of this innovation forum. And those questions were, as we had these deep dives, in addition to the public and private partnerships, what else can the private sector do to stimulate sustainable growth both locally and globally? And what are the approaches that we need to take to improve the local capacities, the infrastructures, and also the skills gap? And finally, Africa has a pervasive entrepreneurial culture. And based upon that, what are the new business opportunities that exist both for the public and private sectors? And I want to share with you a few of the insights that were gained as a result of these deep dives. Some of them include Africa represents a relative blank slate in terms of economic opportunity. Africa is very young. In the country of Ghana, for example, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. Youth, entrepreneurial heritage, language, most speak several languages, but English is one of them. Resources, and a relatively low base of economic activity. This sets the stage for rapid development when it does occur. Also, contrary to popular belief, the great inhibitors to Africa's ability to grow are skills and infrastructure, rather than media and NGO-fueled concerns about corruption, warfare, and health. Africa does not expect and does not want the world to do it for them. They need help and assistance. But what they seek most is enablement, not charity. Africa is actually a rich and complex mosaic. Economic development will require a mix of pan-continent thinking, regional alliances, and country-by-country programs. There are 1 billion people approximately on the continent, and again, many, many different countries, many different cultures, and it's going to require a mix of focus. Our ecosystem is consistently and enthusiastically optimistic that Africa's time is coming. And we are convinced that great global companies like IBM can have a profound impact on their situation and benefit most from early investments. Just a few more insights I want to share with you. Informal economies in Africa are as important and vital to growth as formal economies. If you go to most of the sub-Saharan African countries, you will see people selling just about anything. And it's amazing. They're very innovative about how they go about selling things. I'll give you one example, focusing again on mobile technology. Currency, as we know it here in this country, is not really a focus in many sub-Saharan countries. There's a story of women in Ghana, for example, who actually use mobile phone cards as currency. An example, a father who may be working in a city, in Accra, the capital of Ghana, for example, who has a family in the bush, and he sends money to the family, not through a banking system, but he buys mobile phone cards. He gives the passwords to this woman who has a business, a currency business in mobile phones. She gets the minutes for the phones, but she passes the money to the family, and she gets a commission. So these types of innovative and creative scenarios are happening throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And we certainly believe that given the opportunity for this continent to have the right infrastructure in place, both educational and technological infrastructure in place, that they will be more innovative, inventive, and develop things that the entire world can benefit from, in addition to improving their overall quality of life. I want to end this talk by first letting you know that if you want to know more about the IBM Global Innovation Outlook programs, there is a website that you can go to, www.ibm.com/GIO, www.ibm.com/GIO. I want to spend just a few more minutes talking about Life for Africa. It is a nonprofit that I volunteer for, and as you heard in the reading of my bio, Life for Africa is focusing on building a technology park in Ghana. We already have 1,000 acres dedicated for this purpose. We planned for this to be a major technology hub in West Africa, and also go a long way towards driving globalization from a technology perspective. The African Technology Conference, which will be held July 15th through 18th in Accra, Ghana, is designed to bring together a number of constituencies to brainstorm about how best to build this technology center. We're going to focus on educational infrastructure, technology infrastructure, entrepreneurship, and business and government policy, brainstorming about where Ghana is and where Ghana needs to be a world-class technology center. The outcome will be a strategy that will be the foundation for us moving forward to building this park. We do have major sponsorships from global corporations, including Microsoft, Dell, IBM, and Cisco. We're very excited about this because we think, as you look at India, and John talked about China earlier today, we believe moving forward in time, Africa is the last frontier when it comes to technology, when it comes to new business growth opportunities, that Africa will be the India and China of today. Africa will be that in 5 to 7 years. And so we're working to make that happen. And I'll end with that.
At the University of Florida, we have a program called the Latin American Business Environment Program, where we track conditions affecting business and investment in the region. This is obviously a map of the region. We track the 18 largest economies grouped by either trade agreements or sub-region. These are some of the variables which we pay attention to and attempt to assess and forecast the direction. The news from Latin America continues to be encouraging, positive, And this is now the 5th year of a fairly robust growth cycle. And the economic fundamentals for the region look very good. It's also good news that the political situation is somewhat more stable than it was several years ago, when it looked as though perhaps there would be a kind of leftist populist takeover of many governments in the region. That seems to have stalled. The troubling news concerns the impact of the U.S. downturn on the region. Historically, Latin America has been very much impacted by what happens in the United States, and there's a great deal of concern in the region and for those businesses who deal with the region about the impact of the U.S. downturn, and I'll say some things about that a little bit later on. And related to that is the impact of of volatility in global financial markets. Latin America has very much benefited in recent years by access to global capital markets to fund the current growth cycle. Domestically, as in many other parts of the world, the concern is with growing inflationary pressures. And those are beginning to become more pronounced, I guess we should say. And finally, there is uncertainty, in part because of what's happening in the United States and in part what's happening in the global scene about the future of trade talks and the trade agenda. This last decade has very much witnessed a sort of consensus around opening markets through free trade agreements, and that seems to have stalled now. The intriguing news concerns two things, at least for me. One is the notion that Latin America is decoupling from the United States and is recoupling or coupling with the rest of the world in a way that would mean that the impact on the U.S. downturn would be different than it has been in the past. And also intriguing is what's going on in Cuba. In the last 6 weeks or so, there have been some interesting developments there that suggest the change in Cuba, although small, may be significant. There are significant differences among the countries in the region, and I'll say something about that. The big story has been the 5-year growth cycle that Latin America has had. This is the longest sustained economic growth cycle in 25 years. It began in mid-2003. It continued strong through 2007, and it's forecast to continue on into 2008, probably at a reduced rate. As I said, this is the longest growth cycle in 25 years. All but of the 18 countries we follow, all but one of them grew at more than 3% a year, and 9 of the 18 grew at 7% a year, which is almost Indian and Chinese rates, which is also pretty surprising. Given this good news, you have to look against Latin American economic history, particularly in the post-war period. What you find is a history of stop growth cycles. And the question is, how long will this last, and will it be characterized by an abrupt downturn that's happened? If I could have developed this slide over a longer period of time, and even here you see it looks like a roller coaster sometimes. And the decoupling argument is that that's not likely to happen this time. There's other pieces to this argument, which I'll develop in a moment. Certainly growth will last through this year, probably at a rate less than last year. The second part of the good news is the decline in inflation. Latin America is a region that had very high rates of inflation into the 1990s. In 1993, the weighted regional inflation rate was almost 900%. Much of that was due to Brazil, where it was well over 1,000%, and Brazil is the largest economy in the region. But in fact, all the economies in the region had significant rates of exchange over double digits. So the fact that inflation is now down into a range that is considered to be within normal or appropriate rates is an important accomplishment and is part of the good news story. Now, what are the drivers of this cycle that we're in now, and are they likely to last? And there are, generally speaking, sort of two parts to this that people point to, and there's a debate among experts and specialists about which one is the most important. The one is the nature of the global economy. The external environment for Latin America, the global economy, has been very favorable in recent years. Latin America has benefited a great deal from what's happening, and I'll say a couple of words about that in a minute. The other side of this are changes which have occurred within Latin America itself, political changes and changes in policies. Here the argument is that the governments in the region have moved toward good, solid macroeconomic policies, and there are three policies particularly that are pointed to. Fiscal disciplines, that is, bringing spending and revenue into balance. Inflation targeting, using a system not unlike that in the United States, where central banks set interest rates to control inflation within a targeted range so that businesses can plan out over a period of time in terms of what the expected inflation rate is likely to be. And floating exchange rates. The other thing they've done is they've gone through a series of structural reforms opening their economies to global trade and investment. So a large part of the early initiative of this drive came from export expansion. That has spilled over into expanding domestic consumption now. Domestic consumption is up considerably over the last 2 years or so. Domestic savings and investment, and public spending also. This is a slide representing the budget picture of Latin America. And what it shows is reining in of fiscal deficits, which in 2003 were over 3.3% of GDP, which is beyond the limit that most economists recognize as being appropriate, and building surpluses now over the last several years. And a lot of this is due to the growth of the economies, the growth of exports, the accumulation of foreign reserves and balance of payments surpluses, and also due to other considerations. This is the export side. It's only the last 3 years, but beginning in the early part of this decade, what we saw was a shift away from balance of trade deficits to balance of trade surpluses and current account surpluses. And with the current account surpluses, governments have been able to build up large hard currency reserves, which has been important in managing debt and also providing a kind of rainy day fund against downturns. It's also allowed increased government spending on important projects. Many people say that the real reason for the export expansion has been what has happened in the world economy and the way this has affected Latin America. And the next slide is a measure, an index measuring what are called terms of trade. It's the value of what Latin America has to market on the world economy in terms of what it buys from the world economy. Historically, terms of trade have been unfavorable, and you see going back into the late 90s, they were unfavorable toward Latin America. In recent years, the world economy has been much more friendly to Latin America in terms of trade. Specifically, what we see and what we are painfully aware of in the United States is the rise of global commodity prices. And the most obvious one are energy prices, oil prices. Who are the ones who benefit from them? Oil exporters. And there are several large oil exporters in Latin America, the most important being Venezuela. But other global commodity prices that have risen dramatically in recent years, benefiting some but not all Latin American economies, have been mineral prices, copper prices, for example, at world highs, agricultural products, both temperate and tropical agricultural products, and the like. These are our primary products that for many years was argued was a disadvantage to be in, that countries really should move from producing primary products and exporting them to manufactured goods. But in the last several years, those countries in the region have benefited from this. The increase in commodity prices is importantly a function of the growth rates in China and in India. We have new consumers of goods for manufacturing bases, and that has benefited Latin America. So this is one of the ways Latin America has been decoupled from the United States. It's not selling only to the United States or predominantly to the United States or to Europe. It's now selling to Asia and other emerging economies. Now, it's important to point out that not all Latin American countries have benefited equally from this rise in global commodity prices. The South American natural resource economies, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, plus those in the Andean region, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, have benefited enormously. On the other hand, the small countries of Central America and the Caribbean, which are importers of commodities, particularly energy, have been hurt by this process. So there's a kind of divergence among the countries in the region. Another part of the international environment that has been very favorable to Latin America has been global financial markets and credit, the easy availability of credit. This is a chart measuring foreign direct investment. These are investment by companies in plants and equipment in Latin America, and as you can see, there was a dramatic increase last year, and that inflow of foreign direct investment continues to be very positive. It also plays out, I don't have that data here, in terms of portfolio investment, equities. Latin American stock markets have done extremely well in recent years, and in debt financing, bonds and other kinds of debt financing, also private equity financing. So in all of these areas, there's been an influx of capital and investment into Latin America. Should also point out that domestic capital markets have matured quite a bit. And so a lot of the financing that used to be done externally is now done locally in domestic currencies, which is an important way to decouple from international markets. This is an area where there could be an impact from the current volatility in international credit markets and the subprime crisis in the United States. I talked to a private equity guy a couple weeks ago, and he said that financing's basically dried up for projects in Latin America because of the credit crisis, and financing is more expensive now. What happened during this period is financing got less expensive, and investors began to look for greater returns, and so they looked at emerging markets, not only in China and India, but also Latin America. One of the issues of concern historically has been Latin American debt levels, how much it borrows in foreign currencies. They have been very high, generally relatively high. And in 1980, Latin America went through a very painful debt crisis in which it was unable to service its debt, and the international financial system almost collapsed as a result of that. Debt levels have been held steady, but more importantly, the ability to service the debt has improved because of increasing exports and foreign hard currency reserves. These debts are largely now in the form of corporate and sovereign bonds as opposed to commercial loans, which is also an important difference. The other developments which have been important have been the social environment has improved, poverty is down, and unemployment is also down. These are significant changes. The poverty levels are particularly of concern because these are countries in which, in some cases, close to half the population lives below the poverty line. Those have been coming down because of rising incomes, rising consumption, and also because of social welfare programs. There's also some evidence that socioeconomic inequality has declined. That is a more controversial kind of measure, but if that were the case, it would be very important because Latin America is characterized by a big gap between the rich and the poor. What has not improved has been crime and violence figures. It is a region which has had a significant increase in which it affects almost everybody's life, and it affects the decisions of businesses. It's a cost of doing business in Latin America these days, unfortunately. As I suggested earlier, and the arrow means that things have gotten better if it's pointing upward, the political environment has also improved in recent years. About 3 years ago, there was a fear that what happened in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez was going to spread throughout the rest of the region. It was going to be what some people call the pink tide, basically. And there were a number of elections that year in which if, the candidates of supporting him or identified with supporting him, I don't even know if it's fair to say they support him, it would have changed the political environment and would have also changed the environment for doing business. Presumably it would have been a less business-friendly environment. In fact, most of those elections didn't turn out to elect candidates that were favorable to him. The ones that did, I'll say a few words about in a moment. One reason it's more stable now is there are fewer elections. The elections this year are in small countries, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Paraguay, and there's unlikely to be any kind of radical departure. There is some important legislative elections, the most important one being in Venezuela in November. And then Bolivia and Ecuador are scheduled to vote on new constitutions, which also would change the rules of doing business. Unfortunately, the legal environment, which is a problematic area in many countries, rates of corruption are relatively high, rule of law is low, a series of things associated with it, has not improved as dramatically as possible. Now, what we try to do is sort of group countries together and say some countries look relatively good, some countries look relatively bad, and countries are in between. And this is what our current taxonomy looks like. In the attractive environments, what you're looking at as countries that have solid macroeconomic policies, clear rules of the game, strong government institutions, stable politics, and sustained growth with low inflation. In other words, they are business-friendly in some way. The gold standard has always been Chile, and it continues to be the most solid business-friendly environment, the most dynamic environment in the region. But there are others. Recently, I have added several countries, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, and Brazil, because I think there's been significant improvements in these countries over the last couple years. On the problematic side, these are countries that are pretty well known for having difficult business environments, led by Venezuela. These are populist governments with unclear agendas, weak institutions, changing rules of the game, and flawed macroeconomic policies. For example, in the case of Venezuela, there's a fixed foreign exchange rate, which is generally considered to be overvalued or undervalued, depending on how you raise it, and price controls, which have created a series of distortions in the economy. What are we going to follow the rest of this year? What happens in the U.S. economy? How deep the downturn is. People are calling it a recession now. I don't think we know that for sure. And is there evidence of it spreading to Latin America? Clearly, it's going to spread to Mexico and Central America. It's already happening. Will it go beyond there or not? The status of global commodity prices and financial markets. So far, it's not a major impact, but there has been some impact, as I've said. U.S. politics always have an important impact on Latin America. They follow us much more closely than we follow them. There are lots of Latin Americans among us, among other things, and the big issues are trade, immigration, and I would add the Cuba policy of the United States, which is out of step with the rest of the hemisphere. Inflation, rising food and energy prices are of concern. Hugo Chavez is always a player. He seems to have stepped back a little bit now, but I wouldn't count on that forever. He's in office now until I think it's 2013, according to his current term. And then what's going on in Cuba. And as I said, I think there's some interesting developments there. Perhaps we'll have time to talk about it. If you're interested, the report is available. I brought a few copies with me. You can also get it electronically. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be back in Florida. I strangely seem to have picked up a cold here in Florida, having come from Washington, D.C. I'm not sure what that's all about, but it's always a joy to be here. I was interested to hear John Fremstad start by saying, I'm going to tell you about the Orlando that you don't know. Well, I'm here to tell you about the Iraq that you don't know, and that's called Kurdistan. On Sunday, I returned from almost 4 weeks in Kurdistan, and on each trip I notice that we in the Kurdistan region of Iraq are starting to see things that before we'd only just whispered about. We are building democratic and economic institutions, and we are now having the confidence to open our nation to our friends for investment and for development. This is my first stop since returning to the United States, and it is hard to think of a more appropriate place to come. This is the new home of the first ever chair in Kurdish studies at the University of Central Florida, an honor that is thrilling to me and all Kurds. Thank you. Here we envisage the first step towards greater cooperation and knowledge between our unique two regions, one that will generate understanding and opportunity for Florida and for Iraq's Kurdistan region. This initiative, coupled with another stated mission of UCF, which is to provide international emphasis to curricula and research, and to work to expand the university's efforts to enlarge Central Florida's awareness and understanding of the interconnectedness of the global community. Comparing these two, you have a making of a great, great partnership. I agree with the importance of such interconnectedness. We noted recently that 3 of your area's leading business organizations were joined by more than 250 community leaders to discuss how Central Florida and this region can remain competitive in the new global economy. The Central Florida Partnership, the Metro Orlando Economic Development Commission, and the Orlando Orange County Convention and Visitors Bureau sponsored the Community Leadership Conference themed Going Global Together. How is Kurdistan connected to this region's economics, and how could it be further connected? This is something that we now have the ability to examine and to pursue. We see your region through efforts such as the endowed chair at UCF and such studies as the Metro Orlando Economic Development Commission as wonderful examples of how to deepen initial educational and economic niches and broaden the field to use for all the creativity and resources available. In general, a region with growth potential, such as Florida, requires sufficient infrastructure, organization that includes participation from industry leaders, economic development groups and universities, and seed projects that give momentum and visibility to cluster development sectors. Kurdistan has most, if not all, of these traits. Here in Central Florida, there are a number of strong and established industry sectors, which is a goal that we have sought to establish in our homeland. For in Kurdistan, there are community and industry leaders who are dedicated to advancing the growth of these sectors as the region enhances its standing as a place for good business. Central Florida appropriately boasts 2 growing airports, a fine quality of life, and a competitive pro-business atmosphere with no personal income tax, as we've heard today. It sounds almost exactly like Kurdistan. We too have 2 international airports. We have passed a very liberal and investor-friendly investment law that provide tax breaks and other incentives to the potential investor. We're not quite up there with you as far as standard of living is concerned, however, but we are at least giving ourselves a goal to reach. Like Central Florida, Kurdistan has a good workforce which is ready to go, and we value education. Just as you have developed a high-tech corridor here in Central Florida that draws talents and sends results beyond your region, we see that as a logical opportunity for those looking for similar foundations in Iraq and throughout the Middle East. From tourism to manufacturing to agriculture and transportation, Kurdistan is ready to have others play a big role in its economic future. Kurdistan can act as a bridge for international trade between the United States, Europe, for Iraq, and the Middle East. It is for this reason that we have dubbed Kurdistan as the gateway for Iraq. It provides excellent investment opportunities, and already many international companies have found that it is indeed profitable to do business in Kurdistan. We hope that the ties between Central Florida and the Kurdistan region lead to more formal cooperative ventures that foster growth in areas of mutual benefit, including tourism, trade, and investment, and the advancement of technologies. We will continue to place a great emphasis on enhancing education, research, economic and cultural exchanges between Florida and Kurdistan. The last few years have seen a remarkable foundation being constructed in Kurdistan, one that gives all Iraqis the confidence that our nation will become a bright economic light for the future. Now, in the Kurdistan region, we are ready and eager to build on that great foundation. And we want to open this investment window to all of you, to have you join us to capitalize on our stability and vision. Iraqi Kurdistan is by far the safest part of Iraq, and it is undergoing an economic boom because of this stability. The Kurdistan region's political unification, coupled with a dynamic, business-friendly government and investor-friendly tax law, all make it easier for businesses to invest. Each day we are addressing the challenges of the past as we further democratize our region. Today we have a more transparent society. We have a new generation of civil servants undergoing the rigors of academies that stress serving the people and not themselves as we work to eliminate corruption. We are generating a free press and working to pass a press law that decriminalizes libel. We are building institutions to ensure that we strictly uphold the rule of law. We are nurturing a society that for centuries has maintained ethnic and religious tolerance, even under the harshest circumstances. Attracting investment will help us build our own private sector. Private sector development stimulates economic growth and aids in the reduction of poverty. And it also will lead to a major transformation of our society. Our stability can be the engine to stimulate economic growth and prosperity, which, if built upon, will in turn lead to national stability. Everybody mentions the lure of oil and natural resources in Kurdistan, and we have an abundance of those. But it is our potential for agriculture that for me is the most exciting. The right investments and partnerships in developing our agro-industries will turn Kurdistan into a breadbasket for all of Iraq, and also with enormous export potential for the region. We could produce such products such as honey, olives, nuts, grapes and other fruit, dairy products, meats. These are just to name a few. Additionally, 2008 will be the year for tourism in Kurdistan and not terrorism. I cannot think of a place that has managed its tourism industry better than Central Florida. We certainly could learn from your expertise. While we don't have Mickey Mouse to offer our children yet, we have an abundance of natural beauty with mountains, waterfalls, and potential for some fantastic golf courses, which is something I believe that is quite popular here in Florida. In 2008, we have also begun focusing on developing our banking, insurance, and financial services sector, which are critical for increasing our economic growth. The Kurdistan region's Prime Minister has stated we will facilitate entry into Kurdistan for reputable banks and insurance companies, which in turn will help assure investors that their investments are indeed protected. While we recommend the potential investor enter into joint ventures with locally established companies, our investment law allows for private companies to operate totally independently, own land, and fully repatriate their profits. Some have already seen the benefits of joining in our development. Today, investors have seen the potential for a wide swath of areas, including a regional call center, a tomato paste factory, a 5-star Kempinski hotel, Ford Motor Company franchise opening up, and these are just a few examples of harnessing the economic versatility of Kurdistan. Today's interdependent global economy requires that trade policy be developed at a national, state, and regional level. Kurdistan should be high on anyone's list as you look to where to become a successful participant in the ever-evolving state of global finance and trade. As Pulitzer Prize-winning editorialist and my good friend John Brasier, now the Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives and co-chair of the Middle Eastern Studies Advisory Board, said the Kurds are well known as a stateless people who have struggled against difficult odds. He added that the Kurds have entered into the world's consciousness as never before. Kurdistan has become known as the Iraq that works, Brasier has stated. And I'd like to say that Mr. Brasier, along with others, played a key role in securing the endowed chair at the University of Central Florida. The people of Iraqi Kurdistan are proud of what they have achieved since the genocide of Saddam's regime against our people in 1988, which resulted in the gassing of thousands of our innocent men, women, and children. We've also are proud of what we've achieved since the betrayals that led to the mass exodus of millions of our citizens after the first Gulf War. Americans should also be proud of where Iraqi Kurdistan stands today, a thriving, developing civil society in the heart of the Islamic world. This success story necessitates that the US remain engaged with us, especially in Kurdistan, where Americans are adored, and our experiment at self-rule has by and large been successful. Yet while we have today substantial US political and military engagement, unfortunately the US lags behind in terms of economic engagement. This is why we seek to engage the US private sector in guaranteeing the protection of our hard-earned gains through sustaining our economic growth. Let us build on this success and work to ensure that we secure the financial and political security of our citizens, which they so desperately deserve. You may have seen our publication that has been distributed, the Invest in the Future publication. We think this is an important publication, and it outlines some of the strategic priorities of the Kurdistan region. And if anyone doesn't have a copy, please feel free to contact me or John, and we can ensure that you do get a copy for this. I'll end by stating that the potential for greater cooperation with Kurdistan for the benefit of Florida and for the Kurdistan region is limited only by our imagination. Thank you all very, very much.
How do you see this affecting the economy in South America, and in particularly eclipsing Venezuela?
I do. It's obviously a huge boost to Brazil. Brazil, at the time of the first oil shock in 1973, imported, I think, 73% of its energy. This past year, Brazil declared energy independence or self-sufficiency. It's a function of two things that Brazil now is a leader in. One is offshore drilling and exploration, and the other is biofuels, ethanol. And I think those two cards are going to be huge for Brazil in the future. And I know the state of Florida has particular interests in those things. On the geopolitical, it's an interesting development as well, because now you can have dueling energy diplomacy. Brazil's been fairly quiet in not challenging Venezuela directly, but it's clearly not enamored with Venezuela's attempt to eclipse Brazil as a leader of South America. So I think these kinds of things enhance Brazil's standing. It was a good question.
Particularly an issue I would ask you to address. How are you dealing with the PKK and Turkey as you try to advance?
So it's a very good question, and it is obviously on the front pages of most newspapers, and certainly at the top of our agenda at the moment. A piece of statistic that many of you may not know is that since 2006, the Kurdistan Regional Government's Board of Investment has approved over $7 billion worth of investment projects, of which 40% of it is foreign investment, of which 75% of that foreign investment is actually Turkish investment. So there is an incredibly strong economic tie between Turkey and the Kurdistan Regional Government and the Kurdistan region. And these have been not just hit-and-run projects. These are strategic projects such as airports, such as roads, such as oil exploration contracts. So we have seen certainly the benefits of a strong economic partnership between the Kurds and Turkey. This, we're hoping, will translate into a better and stronger political partnership. We know that we are on the borders with each other, and we have seen the benefits of a strong political and economic partnership. The PKK is a problem for Iraqi Kurdistan, also for Turkey, but it's about coming up with the right mechanism to deal with this problem. I think the efforts of the past of trying to resolve issues of national identity through violence have proven to fail. It's failed on the part of the PKK's efforts to gain more cultural, political, and educational rights in Turkey. And it's also failed on the part of Turkey to try to eliminate this group, this entity. Turkey has waged a 30-year war against the PKK. They've made almost 28 military incursions into Iraq to try to, quote-unquote, eradicate this group, and it's proven to be ineffective. We are now entering an era of peace and of dialogue, and the violence has subsided. There's been some very high-level discussions between Iraq and Turkey. We're hoping to extend those discussions to include the Kurdistan region as well. And I think putting wise heads in a room together, we can come up with a mechanism that addresses the concerns of the Kurds in Turkey, which have valid concerns, but also addresses the concerns of the government in Turkey, which also has valid concerns.
I'm beginning to see, for example, IBM actually is in partnership with many universities throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and also with FedEx and Cisco to mentor students, university students in Ghana, in South Africa, in Senegal, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Ethiopia. I mean, I mentor a couple of students, one in Ghana and one in Ethiopia, for example. So that's one of the things that we're doing. I also see some discussions about potential collaborations with universities throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Many IT companies are focusing on that, having discussions with professors about collaborative research, about consultations and curriculum that would train students to have the relevant skills. So that's ongoing now. There's funding to these universities. IBM, for example, just this past December announced they gave away one of the world's fastest supercomputers to a university in South Africa. So these types of things are happening now.